I think that we are in this moment in history where people are starting to become empowered users of their own mind. They're starting to realize that my mind is kind of like a muscle, and I can use it to help me and supercharge me and to advance my efforts. I think that that's really empowering for a lot of people.
There's this paradox I keep coming back to. In most of the spaces I work in, whether it's classrooms, startups, or big organizations, people say they want innovation. They say they want curiosity. But what they really want most of the time is certainty. But that's not how innovation really works. And that's not how learning works either. Both require ambiguity, iteration, and the willingness to sit in that uncomfortable space where you don't yet know the answer. I've been thinking about this a lot since my trip to New York for EdTech Week, where people kept using words like friction and curiosity. Those are the spaces where engagement actually deepens. And it reminded me of something I learned years ago, that creativity isn't a spark, it's actually a practice. My guest today has been exploring exactly that intersection of how humans learn, create, and adapt in uncertain environments. She's taught innovation and literally wrote the book on it. In this conversation, we'll dig into how innovation really happens, why ambiguity can be our ally, how divergent and convergent thinking work together, and why creativity is never a solo act. So please join us. Dr. Tessa Forshaw is a cognitive scientist exploring how we work, learn, and innovate. She's taught innovation at both Stanford's D.School, at Harvard, where she co-founded the Next Level Lab, and her doctorate work digs into how humans adapt and create in uncertain environments. She's also the co-author of the best-selling book, Innovationish. Tessa, welcome to the Engagement Architect podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Chris.
So you and I met years ago at Stanford.
Mhm.
Can you share a little bit about your journey since then and what shaped your work on innovation?
When I came to Stanford, I was really there with a very strong purpose as a student to understand how the brain learns, especially for adults. I was very interested in understanding how we could make workforce development strategies much more aligned to how the mind works. And at the same time, I had a long-standing passion for design thinking and innovation, and those two things started to come together. So not only how did adults learn in workplace contexts, but how did they learn to be creative? How did they learn to be innovative? And it was by bringing those two things together that my work in design and innovation started to flourish, and how I ended up going to graduate school and now as a scholar at Harvard's Graduate School of Education.
Interesting. So let's dig into innovation a little bit because I think most people think of innovation as that spark of genius. It can only happen with certain people, it can only happen in certain places. But you've been fortunate enough to teach at both IDEO and the Stanford D School. And I think you've seen that it can happen differently. Can you talk about innovation as a practice and not just as a spark?
Absolutely. So it's a complete myth that innovation happens overnight like a light bulb. Often there is some kind of moment where things come together. That's as a result of lots of different connections being made over periods of time in your archival memory, and then eventually them sort of culminating. And so that requires a practice that you're engaging deliberately and frequently and doing a little bit all the time. When we teach innovation, I think one of the biggest things that my co-teacher and I believe is that firstly, the science tells us everybody can be innovative. And secondly, that opportunity for every adult in a workplace to be innovative is incredibly increased if they engage with creativity as a practice, as something they do a little bit of every day.
I love how you talk in your book about how your parents are both airline pilots
Mhm.
and how you've learned about aircraft aerodynamics along the way. And I really liked how you used that analogy to describe divergent versus convergent thinking. For our listeners who may not know the terms, can you give us a quick overview of what they mean and why both are essential to innovation?
Yeah, absolutely. Divergent thinking is definitely the sort of sexy superstar of creativity because it's the how you come up with lots of ideas. In your brain, you're engaging a few different systems, but one most notably called the default mode network, and that's involved in daydreaming. And so if you think about, Chris, when you daydream, you'll often notice that your mind kind of wanders and connects between these really different things, and you come up with these sort of ideas and scenarios that are a little bit like not grounded in the reality or concreteness or plausible even. So that's the system that's really helping you be divergent, that you engage when you're engaging divergent thinking. So when you engage in coming up with ideas, it's the same system that's in play, just a little bit more intentionally and forcefully. Convergent thinking is the inverse of that, I would say. It's about narrowing down, about making decisions, about analysis. That is underrated in creative problem solving, but it's actually just as essential because if you come up with all of the ideas in the world, at some point you need to pick one, right? So creative problem solving really requires this converge, diverge sort of approach. But the third thing that is often completely neglected from the conversation is the role of executive function in this, which is our ability to plan, our ability to complete tasks, stay on track, be goal oriented, to project manage, to stay present. That function is sort of the thing that moves us forward. So if we don't have any executive function and all we do is think divergently, then we're just going to come up with lots of ideas in a really lofty and non-goal oriented way. If we only converge, we're going to analyze and focus on something and make a decision, but we're not going to action it, and we're not going to plan or think about its consequences. So executive function is how we move them forward, or the analogy we use in the book is it's thrust. It's like the airplane's engine
Mhm.
that moves it forward.
Interesting. So let's stick with the brain a little bit. Ambiguity for people can be tricky. And in fact, the brain often treats it as a threat.
Mm,
You even talk about the amygdala hijack.
yeah.
So, how does that affect innovative thinking? And what can people do to keep themselves from shutting down in the face of ambiguity?
I think one of the most important things we need to do first is acknowledge that ambiguity is threatening for a good reason. And so what I mean by that is if I am in a situation where it's dark, I'm driving, I can't see where the road ends, I'm about to go around a corner, I don't know what's around there, being cautious and being very aware and wanting to eliminate as much ambiguity from the situation as possible is 100% the right instinct. But the thing about innovation and creative problem solving is that nearly never is that the consequence of the situation. It isn't like you're going to drive headfirst into a life or death scenario going round the bend. So the risk of ambiguity is also much lower. You naturally have a reaction to ambiguity that is helpful and you don't want to get rid of. And then to say, but the risk of ambiguity isn't high here. The risk of something really bad happening. And so I can change my natural instinct and relationship with ambiguity in this moment so that I can learn from it. I can find unexpected things in it. And I can benefit from the humble act of not knowing and sitting in ambiguity. But to do that, you really have to name it and acknowledge it and that it's helpful. Like, don't berate yourself for having that reaction to ambiguity or be ashamed of it. Like, that's a survival instinct. Let's keep that. But then just recognize that you don't need it right now in this creative problem solving moment.
You've written in your book about the importance of the synthesizing mind, which is going beyond analysis and really weaving insights into new knowledge. Why do you think synthesis is so difficult for many learners, and how can we better teach or cultivate that skill?
Another one of my colleagues wrote a book about the synthesizing mind, Howard Gardner from the Harvard Graduate School of Education. And I was really struck by this book because I was doing a lot of research on abductive reasoning, which is a form of synthesis. But it really made me appreciate that synthesis, how we traditionally have been teaching it, we're sort of losing some of the magic. We often teach analysis, meaning deductive, so reasoning that's from the top down. So if I was doing deductive reasoning and I had post-it notes in my house, I might say, I'm going to sort the post-it notes by color, and then I would put them all into colored packets and count them up. And so that would be a deductive analysis. If I was going to do inductive analysis, what I would do is look at all of the post-it notes and then decide to group them based on what they had written on them. So use the data to group them together. And abductive analysis, I might say, oh, I see that there are post-it notes scattered all over this desk and wall. I wonder if somebody had a brainstorming session here. So, what I'm actually doing is making a hypothesis rather than getting stuck in the detailed analysis of something. I'm thinking about synthesizing it and pulling it together with other inputs and things that I noticed to create a new perspective, frame, or hypothesis. And I think that that is the central component of really good creative problem solving is that moment of, what are all of the different types of inputs telling me here? Huh, I wonder if a meeting happened here, or I wonder if a brainstorm happened here. That process of coming up with a new question that is exciting and grounded, kind of in the way that Sherlock Holmes would do in the books.
So, when you were putting this book together, were there any tools or practices that surprised you and how effective they were just for sparking motivation or engagement?
So we use a lot of iteration, we got user feedback, we prototyped it as a outline and then as a proposal and then with chapter summaries and moving things around. I think that one of the biggest things that really stuck with us as we went through the process was understanding that sitting in the ambiguity is really important. And so we would just keep moving forward and trying things. And the way we knew what to try is one of the central elements of the book, and that is by being metacognitive. So, in the book, we talk a lot about the importance of metacognition in creative problem solving. In writing it, I think that was the most helpful tool that we could have used.
For our listeners who may not know the term, can you talk to them what metacognition is, like why it really matters for creativity and innovation?
Yeah, absolutely. So, metacognition is the act of being meta, so above or self referential, about your cognition, which is your thinking, feeling, and actions. It's about the context of creative problem solving. Being metacognitive is more like helping you be a navigator to determine what steps to do. So instead of needing the map, being metacognitive helps you evaluate what did I just do? What result did I expect? How was that different? What do I think I might need to do next? What feels like the right thing? What do I hope to learn? And then determine what your next steps are at every stage of your creative problem solving journey.
So, let's get a little bit practical. Someone's listening to this. Great, this sounds amazing. I want to start building an innovation mindset. I feel like I don't have one right now. Are there mindsets that really anyone can adopt?
So mindsets are, I think, a really underutilized piece of psychology and cognitive science. And essentially what they mean is it's a way that cognitive framework by which you see the world. So a lot of your listeners may have heard of growth mindset because I think that's widely popular, especially in education settings and for great reason. So in innovation, we think that a mindset approach to innovation is essential to how just about anybody can engage with creative problem solving. My colleague Rich and I decided to analyze 80 different creative problem solving frameworks. And as we were reading all of them, we had this moment of realization that they really were kind of describing that they wanted their participants to actually engage in mindsets. And so we thought, well, maybe these aren't steps of a process that they're trying to evoke, and they certainly don't have to happen in any order. But maybe instead, what they're trying to actually get at without the words is I need you to go through a period of observing the world around you, of having empathy for others. And so, what they wanted is not that you complete a specific tool like an empathy map, but instead that you were putting on the mindset of interacting with others. And so through this analysis, we came up with six mindsets that sort of covered comprehensively this 80 framework. And we worked very hard to make them all start with I, which was probably more challenging than the analysis itself. And they are interactions mindset, going out into the world and interacting with people, the insights mindset, which is that sort of learning from data and from reasoning and from analysis and synthesis, the ideas mindset, which is about coming up with lots of different ideas and seeing things as generative, the iterations mindset, which is a mindset of constantly looking for opportunities for feedback, for iteration, for improvement, the inspirations mindset, which is around looking for opportunities to inspire others about your innovation or your idea and build clamor and get people on board. And then the implications mindset, which is really about having a view and an intentional focus on what are the unintended consequences of the things that I'm thinking about and doing and creating.
So you've delved into social a little bit about how people are an important part of innovation. How do our social connections with our peers, our colleagues, our mentors, how do those enable deeper learning or transfer of innovation into practice?
That's another fantastic question, Chris. I love all of these questions. Creativity is inherently a social practice. And I think one of the biggest myths out there is that it comes about because of a lone genius. My colleague Rich and I did a survey, of general population representative sample of US adults. We asked them in one question to tell us who is an innovator, who comes to mind. And it was incredible the amount of similarity in the responses. People were constantly saying essentially like Thomas Edison, Einstein, Steve Jobs. And this idea of the lone genius is a myth because, firstly, we know that all of those people had incredible teams and minds around them. And everything that they might have been more like the conductor in an orchestra, but they certainly weren't all the pieces of the music. But the other thing that we know is that creativity really comes to life when you bring different people together because all of us think differently. And what I mean by that is I've lived my life and created all of these different memories. Chris, you've done the same. Okay. And so if I put a stimulus or an object in front of us and I ask you about it, you're going to probably say some things that are really different to me because that will bring, when you look at it, it'll bring forward things from your life, which is different to my life, right? And so then when we talk together about it and how we, the object and its different uses and how could we come up with an innovation for it, we're going to get somewhere with it that we never could have got with just you or with just me by ourselves, because by having the two of us, we have exponentially more neural connections. And you might bring forward a new idea that then I take back into my archival memory, which brings forward even more ideas than what I had before. And we keep kind of doing that. And we have exponentially more than we had before. And so creativity requires us to be social. We're going to get so much further if we do this with other people and we leverage all of our different and unique ways of seeing the world. The other thing that we know is that we're much more likely to be creative and engage in creative acts if we see people around us doing it. And so if you are a person who maybe doesn't feel like you're particularly creative, which I'm telling you is not true, but if that was true, a real surefire way to change that is to start hanging out and engaging with some people, maybe someone in your office, you can go sit near them, or you could go take a, an improv class or something. But if you start immersing yourself in communities that are engaging in creative cognition, then that's much more likely to be for you too.
Can we dig into this social a little bit more? Because I found in my teaching at Stanford and also my industry work, when you have groups of people that are trying to get together to do innovative thinking, When you get a group of, say, 3 or 4 people who are homogenous, they're all from the same department, or maybe they're all ed grad students, they come together quickly. They start moving faster, and yet they get to a certain point. When you have groups that are more divergent or different, maybe you have a PhD student over here and you have a symbolic systems major over here, it's more difficult for them to actually communicate at first because they don't speak the same language. It's the same if you bring in an engineer and someone from marketing and someone from sales enablement together. They don't speak the same language, but when you do get them moving, I've observed them moving farther. Why is that?
When you bring together a group of people that come from different backgrounds, often that initial moment of friction puts people off. And so they don't want to push through it and engage. But the reason that that initial moment is tricky is sort of the same reason that I gave you about your and my differences. If I have a completely different mental model, way of talking, set of references in my head to you, it takes much more effort for us to start to find common ground. So there's a lot more cognitive load involved with that initial processing of how do we figure out how to work together and boundary cross and engage with each other. The reason I think that these teams often are so much more successful is because they don't have those same mental models. But down the line, when you get to ideation, the team doing that has different disciplines and lots of differences will be drawing on really different things and bringing them forward. And so they're going to have access to essentially much bigger sets of connections and ideas and thoughts and be able to cue those in each other to come up with infinitely more novel ideas than people who are all thinking from the same script in the same page.
So we've been talking about innovation with individuals and with small groups, but I talk to so many organizations that really struggle with innovation. In your experience, what are the biggest barriers that keep organizations from sustaining innovation, even when they really want to? They're bought into it.
I think innovation is a very intense word. So, we've talked a little bit about some of the myths that come with innovation. And so, often when you say to people, we need to be innovative, or this is an innovation project, people kind of go, innovation, like, oh my gosh. And so, I think one of the first things that's really important is sort of acknowledging that it can feel like this really high bar, this really all or nothing. And so I think one really important thing that organizations can do is to culturally reframe what innovation means in the organization. Like, what are we talking about in terms of innovation, and helping people get their head around the idea that the expectation of them is not to have a billion-dollar unicorn overnight. And that's actually part of why we called the book Innovation Ish, was because we found when people had that reaction, that really being like, oh my gosh, innovation, the way that we could disarm it was, oh, sorry, I meant like, innovation ish. And then all of a sudden people kind of relax and they're like, oh yeah, I can kind of sort of do that, sure. And they completely change how they would approach it. The second thing that organizations can really think about is how to hold space for some of the necessary elements of innovation, like ambiguity, when the organization wants a project plan with dedicated resources and a timeline with clear deliverables. Often, when you're submitting a business case to even allow to do something innovative, they want to know what they're going to get at the end of it. But the point of the process is, well, let's figure it out. To quote a friend of mine, you can't treat innovation projects like BAU projects. You need to have different success metrics, different infrastructure, and different expectations, and be comfortable with the fact that they might not result in anything, or they might result in making a decision not to do something, which is actually, in my opinion, just as great as making a decision to do something, especially if it saves you tens of millions of dollars in failure down the line.
So this is a question that I ask of all my guests. When you look ahead to the future, what excites you about the future of engagement and motivation as it relates to learning and innovation?
I think that we are in this moment in history where people are starting to become empowered users of their own mind. They're starting to realize that My mind is kind of like a muscle. So just how I can train my body to run a marathon and to do a really hard thing, and there are things that I can do to my body that make that easier or make that harder. So too can I use my mind in a way that is either how it works or not how it works. And I can use it to help me and supercharge me and to advance my efforts. I think that that's really empowering for a lot of people because everyone's like, oh, I have a mind. And sometimes these are quite simple things like metacognition, the act of noticing and reflecting, or it might be something like knowing about turning your notifications off when you're trying to get into deep flow so you don't get pulled out of your attention gates. Like all these little things, I think people are finding really motivating. And it's really exciting watching curriculum and teachers and students become empowered by the fact that they have control over their thinking, their choices, their actions, their learning. And I think that's really exciting.
Tessa, thank you so much for joining me today. It's been a really uplifting conversation for me. I've loved reconnecting and digging into your work. And for listeners who want to go deeper, we'll have links to Tessa's work, including her new book, Innovation Ish, in the show notes. Thank you, Tessa.
Thanks so much, Chris. Take care.
What I loved most about that conversation with Tessa was her framing of the empowered mind, that moment when someone realizes they can actually shape their own thinking. It's such a simple idea, but it's also the foundation of motivation. When people recognize that they can train their attention, shift their mindset, or change how they engage with ambiguity, they start to see themselves not as passive learners, but as active designers of their own cognition. And that's really the essence of deep engagement, not just being pulled into an experience, but realizing you can actually co-create it. And maybe that's the takeaway for all of us. Innovation isn't about removing uncertainty. It's about learning to navigate it with curiosity, reflection, and a bit of grace. Thanks for listening to the Engagement Architect podcast. If you enjoyed this episode with Dr. Tessa Forshaw, share it with someone who's wrestling with how to bring more creativity and motivation to their work. And I'll see you next time.